Imagine being arrested for the color of your wallpaper. Imagine a government so alarmed by a single shade that it launched investigations, passed laws, and dedicated federal resources to eliminating it from existence. This is not a dystopian novel. This is not a fever dream. This actually happened in the United States, and the color at the center of it all was a particular shade of yellow. A pigment so dangerous, so deceptive, and so deadly that the American government effectively declared war on it. Stay with us, because by the end of this video, you will never look at the color yellow the same way again. Welcome to Oddplained. To understand why the United States government targeted a color, we need to travel back to the late 1800s, an era of industrial ambition, rapid urbanization, and a chemical revolution that was outpacing human understanding of its own consequences. Cities were growing at a staggering rate. New buildings were rising constantly. And inside those buildings, people were doing something that felt deeply modern and aspirational. They were decorating. Wallpaper was the status symbol of the Gilded Age. If you had wallpaper on your walls, you were telling the world that you had taste, that you had resources, that you had arrived. And among all the patterns and prints available, one color dominated the market more than any other. Yellow, specifically, a vivid, electric, almost luminescent yellow-green shade. Manufacturers had recently perfected using a compound called Scheele's green and later a related pigment that contained arsenic trioxide as a core chemical ingredient. Arsenic, you already know that word carries weight. But here is the thing that makes this story so fascinatingly terrible. Nobody in an average household knew that arsenic was living on their walls. The pigment looked beautiful, it was vibrant, held its color in ways that natural dyes simply could not. And the chemical industry of the 1800s had almost no regulatory framework, holding it accountable for what it put into consumer products, so people hung the wallpaper. They decorated their parlors and bedrooms and nurseries with it. And then, quietly and mysteriously, they began to get sick. Symptoms were strange and inconsistent at first. Headaches, nausea, a persistent weakness that doctors of the time could not quite explain. Children in particular seemed vulnerable. Families would notice that their children were thriving during summer months spent outdoors, only to become ill again in autumn when the windows closed and the household retreated inside. Physicians called it various things. Some blamed the air. Some blamed the constitution of the individual. Some blamed divine punishment, because that was still considered a reasonable medical explanation in some circles at the time. But a handful of scientists and doctors were beginning to suspect something else entirely. The key figure in unlocking this mystery was an Italian chemist named Bartolomeo Gosio, who, in 1892, made a discovery that changed everything. Gosio was studying how certain molds interacted with arsenic-containing materials. What he found was extraordinary. When molds commonly found in damp household environments, the kind of molds that thrived in 19th century homes came into contact with arsenic-containing wallpaper. They did not simply absorb the arsenic, they transformed it. They converted it into a volatile gas, trimethylarsine, a compound that could drift invisibly through the air of a room, be inhaled by its occupants, and cause exactly the kinds of symptoms that had been baffling doctors for decades. The wallpaper was not just decorated with poison. Under the right conditions, it was breathing poison into the room. Now, here is your wow moment, the detail that takes this story from disturbing to truly astonishing. One of the most famous suspected victims of arsenic wallpaper was Napoleon Bonaparte himself. Napoleon died on the island of St. Helena in 1821, and his death has been debated by historians ever since. The official cause was stomach cancer. But in 1961, a forensic analysis of a lock of Napoleon's hair revealed extraordinarily high levels of arsenic, levels consistent with chronic poisoning rather than a single acute dose. And when researchers later investigated the wallpaper in Napoleon's damp, island residence, They found it contained the very same arsenic-based green pigment, the mold, the gas, the slow, invisible poisoning. Napoleon may have been killed not by his enemies, not by exile, but by the color of his walls. Now imagine that knowledge rippling through the scientific community of the late 1800s. Imagine being a public health official who has just learned that one of the most powerful men in modern history may have been felled by fashionable interior decoration. The urgency becomes real very quickly. In the United States, the response came in waves. The first wave was scientific. Researchers and physicians began publishing aggressively about the dangers of arsenic-based pigments. Medical journals that had previously treated wallpaper illness as a curiosity began treating it as a public health crisis. The evidence was mounting, and it was impossible to ignore. The second wave was political. State governments began moving first, as they often do in American regulatory history. Massachusetts, which had a strong tradition of public health legislation dating back to its response to various epidemic diseases, became one of the earliest states to push for restrictions on arsenic in consumer goods. Investigations were launched. Manufacturers were summoned to explain themselves. The political machinery of the progressive era, that reformist impulse that would reshape American government in the early 20th century, began turning its attention toward consumer safety in ways that had never happened before. The third wave was federal, and this is where the story of the government declaring war on a color becomes most literal. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 was a landmark piece of legislation. Most people associate it with meat processing, thanks in large part to Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, which exposed the horrors of the meatpacking industry. But the act was far broader than most people realize. It gave the federal government regulatory authority over a wide range of substances that could be added to food, drugs, and consumer products. Arsenic-based pigments fell within its expanding scope. Federal inspectors began targeting products that contained arsenic. The government funded research into safe alternative pigments. Public health campaigns warned citizens about the dangers lurking in their walls. And manufacturers, facing both legal liability and a collapsing market, began reformulating their products. But the story does not end cleanly there, and that ambiguity is part of what makes it so intellectually honest. The elimination of arsenic from wallpaper and consumer products was not a single decisive moment. It was a long, messy, contested process. Some manufacturers resisted for years, arguing that the science was uncertain, which is a strategy that industries in trouble have deployed consistently throughout history, from tobacco to lead paint to climate change. Some continued using arsenic-based pigments well into the 20th century, particularly in cheaper products sold to consumers who could not afford premium alternatives. And here is the uncomfortable detail that lingers. Arsenic never fully disappeared from the color yellow. Certain industrial applications continued using arsenic-based compounds for decades. And in the global market, regulatory standards varied enormously. Products manufactured in countries without strict chemical regulations continued to circulate, and some estimates suggest that arsenic-laced paints and pigments remained in use in parts of the world well past the mid-20th century. What this story ultimately reveals is something profound about the relationship between government, industry, science, and public health. The war on a color was not really a war on a color. It was a war on the assumption that profit and beauty were sufficient justifications for ignoring human harm. It was a war on the idea that the burden of safety should fall on the consumer rather than the producer. And it was a war that was won slowly, imperfectly, and only through the combined pressure of scientific evidence, political will, and public outrage. The yellow-green wallpaper is gone now. You will not find Scheele's green in your local paint store. The regulations that emerged from this era of reform became the foundation of the consumer safety frameworks that protect people today. When you buy paint, when you buy children's toys, when you purchase any product that might come into contact with your family, there is a regulatory infrastructure standing between you and the kinds of horrors that killed ordinary families in the Gilded Age. and possibly brought down one of history's greatest conquerors. All because a color was too beautiful and too deadly to ignore. This is Oddplained, and we believe that the most extraordinary stories in history are the ones hiding in plain sight. In the patterns on the walls, in the pigments of the past, in the slow, strange ways that science and power and human error collide to shape the world we inherit. If this story made you see something differently today, we would love to know what it was. Leave a comment below. What was the detail that surprised you most? Was it the science of the poisonous gas? Was it Napoleon? Was it the realization that the fight for consumer safety is so recent, so hard-won, and so ongoing? And if you are new here, consider subscribing. Every week, we take a question that sounds strange on its surface and follow it all the way down to where the real story lives. We think you will find it is worth the journey.